I fear not the dark itself, but what may lurk within it. Welcome to Lurk, bringing you creepy, strange, and bone-chilling stories, with your host, Jamie Jackson.
Hey lurkers, before we get started, just letting you know that I do have several episodes lined up here to record. We have the episode that is releasing today, which is this one. We have another episode coming out Sunday, which is the Sunday following the release date. That should be the 19th that will be coming out. That's a true crime episode. Liz is not going to be there for that episode. She is incredibly busy at this point, but I will talk about that later. And I am working on getting the website back on track along with the newsletter and hopefully coming up with a game plan on how to get everything better streamlined and more organized. I have stepped down from my volunteer position with the Scouts, and while that may seem like I have unlimited free time, I do not, because I have a million other things that I do. Because I apparently don't like to sit still. Anyway, let's get started with this week's episode, which is part one of a two-part series. This week, we are setting sail on the Chesapeake Bay to take a look at some of its haunted lighthouses. There are few places more haunting than a lighthouse. Standing alone against wind and water, these lonely sentinels have guided sailors safely home for centuries. They've weathered hurricanes, blizzards, wars, shipwrecks, and countless dark nights when the only thing separating life from death was the beam sweeping across the water. But while their purpose was to save lives, not everyone who passed beneath those lights made it home. Throughout the Chesapeake Bay, stories have circulated for generations. Tales of phantom keepers still climbing the spiral staircases long after the lights were automated. Women dressed in white walking lonely shorelines before vanishing into the mist. Bells ringing from towers that no longer exist. Voices drifting across perfectly calm water where no boats can be found. Whether these stories are legends born from isolation or something far stranger is for you to decide. Tonight, we're traveling the length of America's largest estuary, beginning near the head of the Chesapeake in Maryland before making our way south into Virginia, stopping at some of the bay's most historic, and reportedly most haunted, lighthouses. So dim the lights, grab a life vest, and let's get lurking. Our journey begins at the very northern reaches of the Chesapeake Bay in Cecil County, Maryland. Perched atop the towering bluffs of Elk Neck State Park stands Turkey Point Lighthouse. At first glance, it's surprisingly modest. The white tower rises only about 35 feet tall, but appearances are deceiving. Sitting atop bluffs nearly 100 feet above the bay, its light became one of the highest in the Chesapeake, visible from miles to ships entering from the north. The view today is breathtaking. Quiet trails wind through dense forest before suddenly opening to dramatic cliffs overlooking the bay. Eagles soar overhead, sailboats drift across the water below, and it's hard to imagine a more peaceful place. But like many beautiful places, Turkey Point has accumulated stories that are far less tranquil. What makes this lighthouse unique isn't simply its age. It's the remarkable number of women who kept its light burning. Long before women routinely held positions of authority, Turkey Point became home to generations of female lighthouse keepers. Elizabeth Lusby assumed responsibility after the death of her husband Robert. Rebecca Crouch followed under similar circumstances. Georgiana Brumfield spent more than 50 years connected with the station. And perhaps most famously, Fannie Mae Salter became one of the last civilian lighthouse keepers in the United States before automation forever changed life along the Chesapeake. Night after night, storm after storm, these women climbed the narrow staircase, carrying fuel, trimming wicks, polishing enormous Fresnel lenses, and ensuring sailors they'd never meet found safe passage through dangerous waters. It was exhausting work, and often lonely work. And sometimes it was frightening work. Perhaps that's why some believe not all of them ever truly left. According to hikers, volunteers, and visitors, a woman dressed entirely in white has occasionally been seen walking the bluff near the lighthouse shortly before sunrise or just after sunset. She never appears to be in any hurry. She simply walks along the cliff's edge before quietly disappearing as anyone approaches. Inside the tower, others describe hearing slow footsteps climbing the staircase when no one else is present. Visitors have spoken of sudden cold spots surrounding the lantern room, an overwhelming feeling of being watched, and even dogs refusing to approach the lighthouse after dark. Who, or what, is still keeping watch? Some believe the figure is the wife of a lighthouse keeper, forever waiting for a husband lost somewhere on the Chesapeake. Others think she may be connected to one of the countless shipwrecks hidden beneath the cliffs below. But perhaps the answer is simpler. For more than a century, women devoted their lives to this lonely station. They climbed those same stairs every evening without recognition, without applause, and often completely alone. Maybe the ghost isn't one woman at all. Maybe it's the lingering memory of every keeper who refused to let the light go out. Today, Turkey Point Lighthouse remains one of Maryland's most picturesque historic sites. The surrounding park is open from morning until sunset, and on select days, volunteers open the tower itself to visitors. Just don't be surprised if you feel like someone is climbing the stairs behind you. Leaving Turkey Point, we continue south along the western shoreline of the Chesapeake until we reach the historic waterfront town of Havre de Grace. It's here that Concord Point Lighthouse has watched over the meeting of the Susquehanna River and Chesapeake Bay since 1827. That makes it one of the oldest surviving lighthouse towers on the bay. Unlike the isolated stations we'll encounter later in our journey, Concord Point sits within sight of homes, parks, and city streets. Yet somehow, its ghost stories may be among the strangest of them all. One account, preserved in an 1889 newspaper, reads less like a ghost story and more like something from a nightmare. Late one evening, the lighthouse keeper reported seeing what he struggled to describe. His own words were chilling. He said it was the head of a man, devil, woman, or whatever it was. He described enormous glowing eyes, he said, as big as those of a cow, sparkling like diamonds against a face shrouded in darkness. But the most unsettling detail wasn't what he saw, it was what he smelled. Rather than the sulfur or smoke one might expect from tales of demonic encounters, the lantern room suddenly filled with the unmistakable scent of perfume and cologne. The fragrance became so overwhelming that it completely masked the familiar odor of burning lamp oil. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. More than a century later, visitors continue reporting strange activity. Shadowy figures have been seen moving around the lantern room after closing. Footsteps echo through the empty tower. Unexplained noises drift through the building after dark. Some have even reported lights moving where no one should be. Was the keeper's terrifying encounter simply exhaustion after another long night tending the light? Or was he describing something that still lingers inside Maryland's oldest harbor lighthouse? No one knows, but one thing is certain. For nearly 2 decades, Concord Point has faithfully watched over the entrance to the Chesapeake. And perhaps something else has been watching with it. As we continue south along the Chesapeake, the shoreline begins to disappear behind us. Our next destination isn't a lighthouse you can simply drive to. In fact, almost no one visits it anymore. Standing alone on a small island inside the boundaries of Aberdeen Proving Ground is Poole's Island Lighthouse, Maryland's oldest surviving lighthouse. Completed in 1825, It has watched over the bay for 2 centuries. Ironically, despite its historic importance, it's one of the least accessible lighthouses in the Chesapeake. Because unexploded military ordnance still litters the island from decades of testing, the public hasn't been allowed to visit for years. Nature has slowly reclaimed the grounds, leaving the lighthouse standing in near total isolation. And perhaps that's exactly why its legends have endured. Isolation has a way of allowing stories to grow. Long after the original fog bell disappeared, boaters began reporting something impossible. On calm nights with barely a ripple on the bay, they would hear the unmistakable ringing of an old fog bell. Not loud, not constant, just 3 or 4 lonely strikes drifting across the water before fading back into silence. The bell hasn't existed for decades, yet the sound continues. Then there's the story of the Phantom Keeper. Hunters who once accessed the island, along with military personnel working nearby, have occasionally reported seeing someone standing in the lantern room. Sometimes the figure appears in the doorway. Sometimes they're silhouetted against the windows. And every single time someone investigates, the lighthouse is empty. Others describe hearing footsteps echoing through abandoned buildings. Some have watched lantern-like lights move across the island after sunset, only to disappear without explanation. Perhaps the lighthouse is simply settling with age, or perhaps someone is still making the nightly rounds. When a place has stood watch over dangerous waters for 200 years, maybe old habits are difficult to break. Leaving the deserted shores of Pools Island, we head toward one of the bay's most recognizable offshore structures. Unlike the charming white towers perched on rocky points, Baltimore Harbor Light looks industrial, almost mechanical. Its massive caisson foundation rises directly from the water like something built to survive a war. In fact, it practically was. Completed in 1908, Baltimore Harbor Light stands at the entrance to the shipping channels leading into Baltimore Harbor. When it was built, it was the tallest caisson lighthouse in the world, its enormous foundation necessary because of the deep, unstable sediment beneath the Chesapeake. For a brief period during the 1960s, it even became the world's first nuclear-powered lighthouse, a fascinating footnote in lighthouse history. But impressive engineering hasn't protected it from strange stories. Imagine approaching this lighthouse before sunrise. The bay is calm. Your boat cuts quietly through the water. As the tower grows larger against the gray morning sky, you notice someone standing near the lantern room. A solitary figure watching. Naturally, you assume another maintenance worker arrived before you. But after tying off your boat and climbing the long staircase, you find the lighthouse is empty. That story has been repeated by more than one maintenance crew. Others have reported seeing movement behind the windows while approaching from the water, only for the motion to stop as they draw closer. Perhaps even stranger are the footsteps. Crew members working inside have repeatedly described hearing someone climbing the stairs behind them. Heavy, measured, deliberate footsteps on steel stairs. Everyone assumes another worker is coming up. They pause, wait, and listen, but no one appears. After checking the entire lighthouse, every member of the crew is accounted for. No one was ever on the stairs. Even the heavy steel doors have reportedly opened and slammed shut on windless days. Steel doesn't creak like old wood, and it doesn't flex with every breeze, which makes the reports all the more unsettling. Some locals call the unseen presence the shadow watchman. Whether it's merely an echo created by steel and water, or something that never accepted retirement, no one can say. But even today, workers admit the climb to the lantern room feels much longer when they're alone. The next lighthouse on our journey is unusual. Not because it's haunted, but because it moved. Originally constructed in 1856 atop a dangerous shoal at the mouth of the Patapsco River, 7-foot Knoll Lighthouse spent more than a century protecting ships entering Baltimore Harbor before being relocated in 1997 to Baltimore's Inner Harbor near the National Aquarium. Today, visitors stroll past it without realizing just how extraordinary its history truly is. 7-Foot Knoll is Maryland's oldest surviving screw-pile lighthouse. Unlike stone towers built on land, screw-pile lighthouses were engineered specifically for shallow waters. Long iron piles were literally screwed into the muddy bottom of the bay, supporting a small hexagonal keeper's house perched above the waves. Elegant, ingenious, and incredibly vulnerable. No story captures that vulnerability better than the events of 1933. That year, one of the most devastating hurricane seasons ever recorded battered the Atlantic coast. The Chesapeake Potomac hurricane that carved the inlet between Ocean City and Assateague Island produced enormous seas throughout the bay. 7-Foot Knoll Lighthouse was directly in its path. Keeper Thomas Steinheis was preparing to answer a distress call from a tugboat whose crew had been thrown into the raging water. Before he could leave, his son Earl awoke in terror. He later recalled feeling what he described as an icy hand gripping him while he slept. Not a dream, not sleep paralysis, a hand. Moments later, the distress signal arrived. Convinced the strange experience was a warning, Earl begged his father not to go. But lighthouse keepers didn't ignore distress calls. Thomas launched into 15-foot seas and succeeded in rescuing 4 of the 5 sailors. One man, the tug's chief engineer, never returned. Years later, Earl reflected on that night during an interview with the Lighthouse Digest. I felt that ghostly hand just as plain as could be. I don't believe in spirits, but sometimes I wonder if it wasn't the ghost of the dead chief engineer trying to save his friends. It's one of the Chesapeake's most unusual supernatural accounts. Not a haunting, not an apparition, but perhaps a warning from someone who already knew he wasn't coming home. Sometimes the most chilling ghost stories aren't about the dead refusing to leave. Sometimes they're about the dead trying desperately to save the living. As Baltimore fades into the distance, another lonely tower rises from the bay. Sandy Point Shoal Lighthouse has stood just north of today's Bay Bridge since 1883. Its brick-cased tower seems almost peaceful during daylight hours. But darkness changes everything. Before the Coast Guard removed its light in 2019, boaters occasionally reported seeing the beacon shining when it shouldn't have been. The mysterious glow appeared steady, bright, and completely normal, until they turned their boats toward it. Then, without any warning, the light vanished. Others describe hearing voices drifting across perfectly calm water. There are no boats, no radios, just faint conversations carried by the wind. Anyone who has spent time on the Chesapeake knows sound travels strangely across open water. But every now and then it seems to carry something that shouldn't be there. Leaving Sandy Point behind, we continue south until another of Maryland's most iconic lighthouses comes into view. If you've ever seen a postcard featuring a Chesapeake lighthouse, there's a good chance you've seen Thomas Point Shoal Light. Built in 1875, this elegant screw-pile lighthouse still stands exactly where it was built, making it the last of its kind remaining in its original location on the Chesapeake Bay. Unlike many of the lighthouses we've already visited, Thomas Point never had to be relocated or rebuilt after storms or shifting ice. For more than a century and a half, it has weathered everything the bay could throw at it. And that kind of longevity creates stories. Imagine spending a winter night there. The nearest shore is little more than a faint silhouette. The wind whistles beneath the wooden floorboards. The entire house creaks with every passing wave. Every sound echoes through the empty rooms. Even today, boaters occasionally report seeing something unusual inside the lantern room. The light appears brighter than it should, and sometimes it seems to move, almost as though someone is carrying an oil lantern from window to window. Curiously, the official beacon remains unchanged. Only the mysterious glow seems to wander. Those lucky enough to tour the lighthouse occasionally speak of an odd feeling inside. It's not frightening, just the unmistakable sense that someone else is present. Perhaps that's fitting. For generations, keepers spent their lives making certain no ship struck the dangerous shoals below. If any lighthouse symbolizes quiet dedication, Thomas Point is it. Maybe someone still believes there's work left to do. Continuing farther south, we arrive at one of the most ominously named locations anywhere on the Chesapeake. Before a lighthouse was ever constructed here, before ships regularly crossed these waters, the name itself inspired fear. No one agrees exactly how Bloody Point earned its reputation. Some historians believe Native American tribes fought a bloody battle here, leaving the shoreline covered with the dead. Others insist pirates executed captured sailors along these waters before disappearing into the bay. Another legend tells of colonial settlers discovering bodies floating offshore after attacks on passing vessels. Whatever the truth may be, the name existed long before the lighthouse. And sometimes a name has a way of shaping a place's reputation. The present lighthouse, a 54-foot spark plug style case and tower completed in 1882, still marks the entrance to Eastern Bay. Although automated today, it remains an active aid to navigation. By day, it's simply another working lighthouse, but by night, the stories begin. Boaters have reported seeing phantom lanterns drifting through the heavy fog where no boat should be. Others describe hearing voices carried over the water, despite complete darkness in every direction. Several have claimed to glimpse figures standing inside the abandoned tower itself. Each account is slightly different, yet nearly all end the same way. As the witness draws closer, everything disappears. Perhaps the fog is playing tricks. Perhaps the bay is echoing distant sounds. Or perhaps Bloody Point has lived up to its name for far longer than anyone realizes. Some places are remembered for beauty, others for what refuses to be forgotten. As we continue south, one lighthouse breaks our pattern. The Hooper Strait Lighthouse no longer stands where generations of keepers once tended its light. Originally built offshore in 1879, it now resides safely at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum in St. Michaels, Maryland, where thousands of visitors walk through its rooms every year. It's beautifully preserved, warm, and inviting. Hardly the sort of place you'd expect ghost stories to survive. Yet they have. Volunteers working late have occasionally spoken of footsteps echoing across the wooden floors after visitors have gone home. Doors seem to shift. Unexplained noises drift through otherwise empty rooms. There's nothing violent, nothing threatening, just enough to make someone stop, look around, and wonder if they were really alone. Unlike some of the bay's more famous haunted lighthouses, Hooper Strait stories remain informal, passed quietly between volunteers shared after closing, the kind of stories that rarely make newspaper headlines. But perhaps those are the stories worth paying attention to. After all, not every haunting announces itself. Sometimes it simply waits. Few Chesapeake lighthouses look more haunted than Sharp's Island Light. Even in broad daylight, something feels wrong about it. Standing alone in open water, the lighthouse leans dramatically to one side, earning comparisons to the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Ice, storms, and the relentless Chesapeake slowly push the structure off balance. Long before this lighthouse leaned, another stood there. That earlier screw pile lighthouse met an unbelievable fate in 1881 when enormous ice floes literally tore it from its foundation, with the keepers still inside. Imagine waking to discover your entire lighthouse drifting across the Chesapeake Bay. Miraculously, everyone survived. The current Cason Lighthouse replaced it in 1882, but the island itself didn't survive. Year after year, erosion consumed Sharp's Island until the land disappeared beneath the bay. Today, only the lighthouse remains, an abandoned sentinel standing where an island once existed. Perhaps that's why its ghost stories feel different. Watermen have reported seeing the lantern glowing years after the light stopped operating. As always, the pattern repeats. A boat approaches and the light disappears. Maintenance crews have described footsteps climbing the spiral staircase while they're working alone. Others speak of hearing quiet conversations inside empty rooms. No voices can be understood, only the unmistakable sound of people talking. Local fishermen often say former keepers never truly abandoned the station, not after watching the island they called home slowly vanish beneath the Chesapeake. There's something deeply unsettling about that thought. Buildings can be moved, lights can be extinguished, but where does a place go when the land beneath it disappears? Perhaps the lighthouse remembers. Our journey now reaches the mouth of the Patuxent River. Standing near one of the bay's narrowest passages is Cove Point Lighthouse, one of Maryland's most picturesque and surprisingly active historic lights. Unlike the lonely offshore towers we've been visiting, Cove Point feels welcoming. The keeper's house has been beautifully restored, and guests can actually spend the night there. Tours welcome visitors throughout the summer. It hardly seems like the setting for a ghost story, yet that's exactly where they occur. Interestingly, almost none of the reported activity centers on the lighthouse tower itself. Instead, the stories focus on the keeper's home. For generations, entire families lived here. Children laughed in these rooms, meals were served around the kitchen table, and storms trapped loved ones indoors for days at a time. Unlike isolated offshore stations where keepers often worked alone, Cove Point was very much a family home. Perhaps that's why witnesses describe something different here. Guests have reported hearing footsteps upstairs while every room was empty. Doors have quietly opened on their own. Lights appeared after closing. Figures were seen standing in upstairs windows before disappearing. Several visitors describe sensing the presence of a woman inside the house. Not frightening or hostile, just simply there. Maybe she's still waiting for a supply boat, or still watching for a husband tending the light. Still keeping a home that never truly stopped being hers. Sometimes the most powerful hauntings aren't born from violence. Sometimes they're born from the ordinary lives lived in extraordinary places. Continuing south along the western shore of the Chesapeake, we arrive at one of Maryland's best-loved historic sites. Unlike most of the lighthouses we visited tonight, Drum Point Lighthouse no longer stands where it once guided mariners. Originally built at the mouth of the Patuxent River, it was carefully relocated to the Calvert Marine Museum, where visitors can now walk through the beautifully restored structure. But moving the building may not have moved everything inside it. For nearly 80 years, Drum Point endured collisions with ships, crushing winter ice, violent storms, floods, and even the blackout restrictions of World War II. It witnessed generations of keepers raising families inside a surprisingly tiny home balanced above the water. And that history seems to linger. Visitors and museum staff occasionally report seeing the apparition of a young brunette woman walking quietly around the lighthouse. Others hear children's laughter drifting through empty rooms. Footsteps echo from the upper floor when no one else is inside. Some have even caught movement from the corner of their eye, only to find every room deserted. The stories surrounding Drum Point rarely involve fear. Instead, they carry something almost bittersweet. This wasn't simply a lighthouse, it was a home. Children grew up here. Families celebrated birthdays here. They worried through storms here, and perhaps they never completely left. As one longtime volunteer reportedly remarked, some houses remember the people who loved them. Drum Point feels like one of those places. By now, one thing has become impossible to ignore. The farther south we travel along the Chesapeake, the farther apart the lighthouses become. The towns disappear, the shoreline fades into the distance. Eventually, all that's left is open water and whatever company a lighthouse keeper could make for himself. That's exactly the world that surrounded Hooper Island Lighthouse. Standing nearly 3 miles offshore, this 63-foot cast-iron caisson lighthouse has been battling the Chesapeake since 1902. Listed on the National Register of Historic Places, it's unique among Maryland's caves and lights because it still retains its original watchroom and lantern. Today, it sits alone. Rust streaks down its iron walls, waves slap endlessly against its foundation, and after sunset there isn't another light for miles. If ever there was a place where loneliness could take on a life of its own, this is it. Unlike some of the stories we've already heard, Hooper Island's hauntings aren't tied to one dramatic tragedy. Instead, they're rooted in routine. The endless, repetitive routine of lighthouse life. Night after night, year after year, keepers climbed the spiral staircase, checked the lamp, cleaned the lens, wound the machinery, and watched over strangers they'd never met. Perhaps that's why the most persistent legend is so simple. People still hear someone climbing those stairs. Maintenance crews have described heavy boots crossing the watchroom overhead while they're alone. Doors have opened on their own, footsteps circle the lantern room, yet every search ends the same way. No one is there. Boaters tell of an even stranger story. Approaching the lighthouse after dark, they sometimes notice a lone figure standing silently in the lantern room. Approaching the lighthouse after dark, they sometimes notice a lone figure standing silently in the lantern room. The silhouette never waves, it never moves, it just simply watches. Some have even photographed what appears to be someone standing in the windows. Curious, they steer closer. As the distance closes, the figure disappears. By the time they reach the tower, it's empty. Eastern Shore watermen have shared versions of this story for decades. Most simply shrug. "The old keeper's still working," it's said almost casually, as though no further explanation is necessary. And perhaps it isn't. After all, if you've spent a lifetime protecting sailors, why would you stop now? Just when you think you've heard the strangest lighthouse story on the Chesapeake, you arrive at Holland Island Bar. Few places combine history and mystery quite like this isolated lighthouse. Even without its ghost stories, its location is enough to unsettle anyone. Nearby lies Holland Island, once home to a thriving fishing community before erosion slowly swallowed it beneath the bay. Not far away is Bloodsworth Island, used for decades by the U.S. Navy as a bombing range. And just across the water sits Point Lookout, a place we'll visit later in Part 2 that many consider one of the most haunted locations in America. It's almost as if every direction holds another ghost story. The lighthouse itself was completed in 1905. Like so many Chesapeake lights, it stood isolated for weeks at a time. Storms could cut it off from the mainland. Supply boats were never guaranteed. The keepers simply learned to live with solitude. Perhaps that's why one of the earliest legends centers on keeper James Crockett. Following his death while serving at the station, fellow watermen quietly remarked the tower never quite felt empty again. Boaters reported seeing movement inside the lantern room. Others described an oil lamp moving through the tower long after automation. Still others spoke of a lone shadow standing in the windows. Whether Crockett truly remained behind, no one can prove. If that were the only mystery surrounding Holland Island Bar, it would already rank among the Chesapeake's eeriest lighthouses. Instead, 1931 happened. One evening, the keeper at nearby Solomon's Lump noticed something immediately wrong. Holland Island Bar's light wasn't burning. For a lighthouse keeper, that wasn't simply unusual, it was an emergency. The sheriff and local physician hurried to the station. The keeper's boat was still tied securely outside, and nothing appeared to be disturbed, until they stepped inside. The front door stood wide open, furniture had been overturned, and blood covered the floor. And there, lying in the middle of the room, completely unclothed, was Keeper Ullman Owens. Beside him rested nothing more than an ordinary butcher knife. Investigators immediately assumed murder, but then the mystery deepened. Doctors found no stab wounds, no cuts. There were no obvious injuries capable of producing the shocking amount of blood scattered throughout the room. Officially, Owens died of natural causes. Unofficially, almost no one believed it. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed he'd become entangled with rum runners during Prohibition. Others whispered about jealous husbands. Apparently, he was known to be quite the womanizer. Still others insisted the lighthouse itself had witnessed something no one could explain. Nearly a century later, the questions remain unanswered. And if that weren't strange enough, the lighthouse somehow survived another unbelievable event. In 1957, Navy pilots training nearby mistook Holland Island Bar Lighthouse for a target. 3 rockets slammed into the tower. Fortunately, none carried live explosives, and the 4 keepers inside escaped with their lives. The lighthouse wasn't nearly as fortunate. The damage accelerated its decline until it was eventually decommissioned. Ghost stories often grow from tragedy. Holland Island Bar didn't need anyone to invent one. Its history is strange enough on its own. Leaving the eastern shore behind once again, we arrive at the western side of the bay near the mouth of the Potomac River. Here stands Point No Point Lighthouse, quietly watching over one of the Chesapeake's busiest stretches of water. Built in 1830, the station helped fill a dangerous 30-mile gap in navigational aids between Cove Point and Smith Point. Like many Chesapeake lights, it became home to generations of keeper families. Just imagine living there. Water in every direction. Winter storms shaking the walls. Fog so thick the mainland simply disappeared. For weeks, your entire world became one small house balanced above the bay. It shouldn't surprise us that Point No Point has developed one of Maryland's strongest paranormal reputations. The most frequently reported apparition is a woman. Witnesses describe her standing quietly near the top of the staircase, wearing clothing from another century. She never speaks, she just simply watches. And then she's gone. Others report hearing footsteps climbing the tower. Not quick footsteps, these are slow, measured, and heavy. Exactly the pace you'd expect from someone beginning another night's work. Caretakers also described an overwhelming feeling that someone else occupies the keeper's quarters. Perhaps even more unsettling are reports of children laughing inside an otherwise empty lighthouse. Then there's the rocking chair. Visitors have claimed to hear it moving by itself, back and forth, even when every room is empty. Maybe old wooden buildings simply make strange noises. Or perhaps some families never truly moved away. After spending decades surrounded by water, perhaps the lighthouse simply remained home. Our final stop for tonight lies deep within the waters surrounding Smith Island. If you've noticed a pattern among Chesapeake ghost stories, Solomon's Lump fits it perfectly. It's small, it's isolated, and getting there has never been easy. Built in 1895, this classic screw-pile lighthouse guarded the dangerous shoals of Kedges Strait. By now, you probably won't be surprised to learn that people still report hearing someone inside. Fishermen describe knocking echoing from the empty structure. Others have watched what appears to be someone carrying a lantern through the windows. The figure always disappears before anyone reaches the lighthouse. Voices seem especially common here. Conversations drift across the calm water. Someone calls out, someone answers. Yet no boats are anywhere nearby. Local lore suggests these may be the lingering voices of shipwreck victims lost on the surrounding shoals. Whether that's true, no one knows. But standing alone on the water after sunset, hearing voices with no visible source is enough to convince even skeptics that the Chesapeake keeps its secrets well. As our journey continues, we're about to leave Maryland behind. Ahead lies Virginia. Its lighthouses have watched Civil War battles, Atlantic hurricanes, and some of the most dangerous waters on the East Coast. And if Maryland's keepers never truly abandoned their posts, Virginia's stories are even harder to explain. As we've made our way from the towering bluffs of Turkey Point to the lonely waters surrounding Solomon's Lump, one thing has become abundantly clear. The Chesapeake Bay isn't just home to some of America's most beautiful lighthouses. It's home to generations of stories that refuse to fade with time. Whether it's the sound of phantom footsteps climbing iron staircases, mysterious lanterns shining from long abandoned towers, or the lingering presence of keepers who may have never truly left their posts, these lonely beacons continue to remind us that history has a way of echoing long after the lights have gone dark. But our journey isn't over. In our next episode, we'll cross into Virginia where the Chesapeake grows wider, the waters more dangerous, and the legends even darker. We'll explore isolated offshore towers, Civil War history, mysterious shipwrecks, and one of the most haunted places in America, Point Lookout. If the spirits of Maryland's lighthouse keepers are still standing watch, you won't want to miss what awaits us farther south. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, be sure to follow Lurk wherever you listen to podcasts so you never miss a new investigation. If you have a favorite haunted lighthouse, a local legend, or even a paranormal experience of your own, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us on our social media pages or through our website. If you're enjoying the show, one of the best ways to support us is by leaving a 5-star review and sharing the podcast with your friends. It really does help others discover Lurk and allows us to continue bringing you these stories from some of the world's most mysterious places. Until next time, remember, just because the light has gone out doesn't mean the keeper ever left. Keep looking over your shoulder, keep questioning what goes bump in the night, and as always, keep lurking.